The planet was a battlefield. Every corner, every building, a target for war. Zara, a fierce warrior of the Nari, an advanced alien race, was in the thick of it. Her long, silvery hair whipped through the air as she ran across the crumbled ruins of a once thriving city. She wore battle armor that glowed with energy, and her eyes, a bright shade of purple, scanned the war zone with precision. She was one of the elite soldiers, chosen for her unmatched strength and ability to defeat any enemy. But today, she wasn't winning. Today, everything was falling apart. Zara and her squad had been sent on a mission to eliminate a small human settlement on the outskirts of the planet. The human resistance had been growing stronger, and her commanders had made it clear humanity had to be crushed. Zara's heart had never fully agreed with this mission, but as a soldier of her people, she followed orders. The attack had begun smoothly at first. Her team moved through the settlement, neutralizing resistance with advanced weaponry and technology. Zara had fought bravely, dispatching human soldiers with swift, decisive strikes. She was strong, quick, and ruthless, taking down enemies that many would have hesitated to face. But as the battle raged on, something started to feel wrong. The humans weren't retreating. They were fighting back harder than expected. The Neri had underestimated them. The rebellion they thought would fall easily had proven to be a far greater challenge. Then, the trap was sprung. Zara's entire squad was caught in an ambush. Explosions rocked the ground beneath them, and the sky turned dark with the smoke of destroyed buildings. The ground shook, and Zara's senses screamed at her. Something was off. She reached for her communicator, but before she could speak, the enemy's hidden forces, humans and automated drones, pounced. One of her own teammates was shot. Another was blown apart by a bomb. Zara's reflexes kicked in, but in the chaos, she couldn't protect everyone. The most shocking blow came when Zara turned to see one of her most trusted allies, Commander Raylak, a veteran warrior, running away, abandoning his post. And her eyes widened in disbelief as he disappeared into the smoke, leaving her behind to die. Zara had always admired Raylak's leadership, but now she saw his true colors. He had betrayed her, leaving her to face the full force of the enemy alone. Zara gritted her teeth, pushing forward through the pain. She was a warrior. She couldn't fall now. But just as she rallied to fight back, a powerful blast struck her from the side, knocking her off her feet. The last thing she saw before blacking out was the dust cloud rising from the explosions and the distant, cold stars above her. When Zara regained consciousness, she was alone, lying on the ground among the rubble. Her body ached as she struggled to sit up. Blood soaked her armor, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The once vibrant city around her now lay in ruins. Zara's heart raced, not just from the pain, but from the overwhelming realization she had been abandoned by her own people. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. Every movement sent a shock of pain through her body. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stay. If her people, if Raylak, had left her to die, the only chance she had was to survive on her own. Suddenly, there was a faint sound, a soft hum. Zara's ears perked up. It was coming from the direction of a nearby alleyway. With her remaining strength, she crawled toward the noise, her eyes darting back and forth, expecting another enemy attack at any moment. But when she turned the corner, she saw something she never could have expected: a human soldier. Zara's heart skipped a beat. She expected him to be part of the enemy forces, ready to finish the job her own people had started. But this soldier wasn't aiming a weapon at her. Instead, he was crouched down, his figure half hidden in a cloak that shimmered, bending the light around him. He was using a cloaking device, something humans were not known for. The man stood up slowly, his face revealed. His short, dark hair and sharp blue eyes seemed calm, even in the midst of the destruction. His clothing was simple, standard human military garb, but his movements were deliberate, controlled. He wasn't afraid. And that was when Zara realized this human wasn't here to kill her. He was here to save her. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her words coming out in a rasp. "Why?" she managed to croak, her voice weak. The soldier didn't immediately answer. Instead, he walked over to her, checking her wounds with expert care. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a medic too. Zara's mind raced, trying to process everything. Why would a human, one of the beings she had been taught to despise, bother to save her? She had fought against humanity, killed their people, and now, when she was at her weakest, a human was trying to save her life. The soldier finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Zara stared at him, confusion and anger swirling inside her. "You should have left me to die," she spat, her voice low with contempt. "I am your enemy. You've lost this battle, human. Your people, all of them are weak." Ryan, the human soldier, shook his head. "No, we're not weak, and I won't leave anyone behind, not even an enemy." Zara's eyes widened. She couldn't comprehend it. All her life, she had been taught that humans were nothing more than primitive, weak creatures. Yet here was one who was willing to save her, someone who, despite the odds, was willing to risk his life for hers. The confusion lingered in Zara's mind, but there was something else too. A strange sense of gratitude. She had been betrayed, abandoned, and left to die. But this human had come for her. Zara had always believed that strength was all that mattered. But as she lay there, bleeding and broken, she realized that perhaps there was something more to strength than just power. This was just the beginning. The beginning of something Zara could never have imagined. The beginning of an unlikely alliance. Zara's mind spun as the human soldier carefully applied a medical patch to her side, sealing the gaping wound. She could feel the cold, sterile sensation of the healing technology working its way into her skin. Despite herself, she was impressed. She had always thought of humans as weak, barely capable of defending themselves, let alone offering advanced medical treatment. But now, lying in the dirt and rubble of a destroyed city, Zara found herself questioning everything she had ever been taught. She glanced up at the human. His name, he had said, was Ryan. His calm demeanor was the exact opposite of the chaos surrounding them. The once vibrant city was now just a graveyard of metal and stone, but Ryan seemed unfazed by the destruction. It was almost as if this wasteland was his natural environment. His movements were practiced, as though he had done this many times before. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a survivor. Zara's mind continued to race. Her body was still weak, the wound on her side throbbing with pain. She didn't trust humans, not after everything she had been through. They were supposed to be the ones who were helpless, who depended on alien forces to protect them. Yet here she was, relying on a human to save her life. Ryan finished with the bandage and stood up, offering her a hand to help her to her feet. Zara hesitated for a moment before taking it. She was still suspicious. Why would a human save her? They were enemies. She had killed their soldiers, their people, yet this man had risked everything to pull her out of the line of fire. He was the enemy, yet he had acted with more honor than her own people. "Where are we going?" Zara asked, her voice still hoarse. Ryan looked down at her, his face serious but not unfriendly. "We're not safe here. The enemy will be looking for us soon. We need to move." Zara nodded, though she had no idea where they could go. This city had once been a stronghold, a place where the Nari had ruled, but now it was just a ruin. She had no idea where her squad was, or even where her commanders had gone. They had abandoned her, left her to die in the dust, while Ryan had come to her rescue. They began moving quickly, Ryan leading the way through the wreckage of the city. Every step was a challenge for Zara. Her injuries still made it difficult to move, and the blood loss had left her feeling dizzy. But she pushed through it. She had always been strong, and despite everything, she wasn't about to let a human see her fall apart. They moved in silence for a while, Zara focusing on each step. The city had been heavily bombarded, and much of it was still burning. There were twisted metal beams and broken buildings everywhere, making every path treacherous. The once grand architecture of the Nari was now reduced to ash. It was hard for Zara to accept that her people had been brought so low. The place she had once called home was now nothing more than a tomb. Despite her growing weakness, she couldn't help but wonder about Ryan. He was different from what she had expected. When she first saw him, she thought he was just another soldier, just another human who had come to finish the job. But now, as he guided her through the ruins, she saw something else in him. He wasn't just a soldier. He was something more. He had the heart of a warrior, yes, but there was kindness in him too, something she hadn't expected. She stole a glance at him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Ryan paused, turning to look at her. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Zara saw something beyond the warrior. She saw understanding. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "You're not my enemy. You're a person, and you're hurt. I'm not leaving you here to die." Zora blinked in surprise. It was such a simple answer, but it hit her harder than she expected. She had never considered that humans might think like this. She had always believed that they fought for survival, just like any other species, without caring about honor or loyalty. But Ryan had just shown her a different side of humanity, one that was driven by empathy. "Why?" Zara asked again, her voice softer this time. "Why not leave me? I am your enemy. I was sent here to kill you." Ryan's expression softened. He didn't seem angry or upset, just calm. "You're not my enemy now," he said. "Right now, we're just two people trying to survive. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that happens." Zara's chest tightened at his words. It was almost too much to process. She had been trained to fight and conquer, to destroy anything that stood in her way. But this human, this soldier, had just saved her, and he didn't want anything in return. It made no sense. They continued their journey through the city, moving faster now as Ryan led them toward a safe house he had set up earlier. The closer they got, the more Zara could sense the enemy closing in. Her own people were looking for her, and the human soldiers would be right behind them. They needed to hurry. After what felt like hours of walking through the shattered city, they finally reached the safe house. It was hidden beneath the ruins, well protected from the enemy sensors. Ryan quickly shut the door behind them, and they both collapsed in the dimly lit room. Zara sat down, trying to steady her breath. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, but for the first time since the battle began, she felt a small sense of relief. She was alive, and she was with someone who cared enough to save her. Ryan gave her a moment to catch her breath before he spoke again. "We'll stay here until we can figure out a way out of the city," he said. "You're safe for now." Zara nodded, her head spinning. She didn't know what to think anymore. The world she had once known was crumbling, and everything she had believed in was being torn apart. But one thing was clear. The human who had saved her was not just a soldier. He was something else entirely. And in that moment, Zara knew that everything was about to change. The dim light in the safe house flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Zara and Ryan sat quietly, the sound of their heavy breathing the only thing breaking the silence. Zara's side still ached, the wound throbbing despite the healing patch, but the pain was nothing compared to the storm raging outside the walls. The city, once a shining example of Nari power, was now a battlefield. It was only a matter of time before the enemy found them. Ryan sat across from Zara, his gaze fixed on the small screen in front of him. It was a communication device, but the signal was weak, flickering in and out as he tried to track the enemy's movements. His face was tense, his focus unshakable. Zara couldn't help but watch him. She had never seen a human so determined, so single-minded. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" Zara asked, her voice quieter than she intended. She hated how vulnerable it made her sound, but she couldn't hide the doubt creeping into her mind. They were alone now, with no allies and only the faintest chance of survival. Ryan didn't look up from the screen, but his voice was steady when he answered. "We will. I've been in worse situations." Zara tried to hold back a laugh. "Worse than this?" Ryan finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, much worse." Zara studied his face, wondering what kind of person could stay so calm in the middle of chaos. She had heard stories of human soldiers, of their resilience and bravery, but she never truly believed them. Now she was seeing it firsthand, and despite herself, she was impressed. Outside, the sounds of distant explosions rumbled through the walls, reminding them that the war was far from over. The enemy was closing in, their forces relentless. Zara's thoughts began to race as she considered their options. They couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, the safe house would be found, and they would be trapped. "We can't just hide," Zara said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. "We need to fight back." Ryan's eyes narrowed, his hand still resting on the communication device. "And what's your plan? You're still injured." Zara's jaw clenched. She hated being treated like a burden, but she understood why Ryan said it. She was weak, wounded, and in no condition to fight. But that didn't change the fact that the enemy was closing in, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. "I don't care about my injuries," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We fight, or we die. It's that simple." Ryan studied her for a long moment, and for the first time, Zara saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. He nodded, slowly. "All right. We fight. But we'll need a plan." Zara glanced around the safe house. It was small, hidden beneath the rubble of a collapsed building, with just enough supplies to last a few days. There was no escape route, no easy way out. They were surrounded, trapped in a city that was quickly becoming a war zone. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. "We'll use the city's ruins to our advantage," she said, her mind already working on a plan. "We set traps, ambush them. We can't take them head on, but we can make them think we're still hiding." Ryan's eyes gleamed with interest as he listened. "I like the sound of that. What do you need?" Zara thought for a moment, trying to piece together what little she had. "We need weapons. I don't care what. Guns, explosives, anything we can use to slow them down. And we'll need a distraction. If we can draw their forces away from the safe house, we might have a chance." Ryan nodded. "I'll handle the weapons. You focus on the traps." Zara felt a surge of adrenaline. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. And right now, that was all they had. She stood up slowly, feeling the ache in her side as she moved. The pain was constant, but she pushed through it. There was no time to rest. They had to act fast. The two of them worked quickly, preparing for the fight ahead. Ryan moved with purpose, gathering what little weaponry they could scavenge from the ruins of the city. Zara, meanwhile, began to set traps. She used everything she could find. Broken machinery, old explosives, anything that might give them an edge. Every step she took was a reminder of how far they had fallen. Once she had been a commander, leading her people to victory. Now she was setting traps with a human soldier, fighting to survive. As they worked, the enemy grew closer. Zara could feel the weight of time pressing down on them, the seconds ticking away as their pursuers drew nearer. The faint sounds of footsteps, the crackling of radios, all told her that the Nari were closing in. Ryan came over to her, his face grim. "We need to move. They'll be here any minute." Zara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear them too. The enemy was getting closer, and there was no turning back now. They retreated into a corner of the safe house, hiding in the shadows as the sounds of the enemy drew nearer. Zara's breath caught in her throat as she listened. They were almost here. She couldn't stop the fear from rising within her. She had fought countless battles, but this was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her life, and for Ryan's. The door to the safe house creaked, and Zara's heart skipped a beat. They were here. Ryan motioned for her to stay quiet, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the enemy. Zara held her breath, waiting. Every second felt like an eternity. She could hear the enemy outside, their voices muffled but growing louder. This was it. The fight for survival had begun. Zara's hand went to the weapon at her side, the pulse of anticipation running through her veins. The time for hiding was over. It was time to fight. The stench of smoke filled the air as the explosion in the distance rumbled like an angry beast. Ryan and Zara crouched in the darkened corner of the ruined building, their bodies tense, ready for whatever came next. The sounds of enemy forces moving closer sent a cold shiver down Zara's spine, but she refused to show it. She was a commander, and commanders didn't show fear. They led. Ryan's eyes were focused on the makeshift map they had drawn, tracing their route through the city. They had only a few moments before the enemy would reach them, but he seemed unfazed. Zara admired his calmness under pressure, though part of her wished she could be as unshaken. "What's the plan?" Ryan whispered, his voice low. Zara took a deep breath. "We're going to split up. We'll leave a trail for them to follow, then set the final trap near the old industrial sector. It's our best shot." Ryan nodded, his jaw tight, but something in his eyes made Zara pause. There was a hesitation there, a flicker of doubt that she hadn't noticed before. She frowned, but before she could ask him about it, they heard footsteps approaching. Zara's heart raced. She had trained for moments like these. She knew the enemy's tactics, their movements. But even so, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. The walls of the ruined building seemed to close in around her as the enemy's footsteps grew louder. Without another word, she stood and motioned for Ryan to follow her. They crept through the dark hallway, moving silently, trying to stay hidden from the Nari forces that patrolled the area. The faint sound of breathing, the scrape of metal against concrete. They were close. Ryan followed her lead, but she could feel the tension building between them. Something wasn't right. Zara tried to push the feeling away, focusing on the task at hand. They needed to escape. They had to survive. They reached the next corner, and Zara paused. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't make a sound. She had to be careful. Every decision, every movement mattered. She glanced at Ryan, but to her surprise, he wasn't looking at her. He was staring down at his weapon, his hands shaking slightly. Zara's instincts flared, a red flag rising in her mind. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp but low. Ryan's eyes flicked up to meet hers, but there was something in his gaze that made her stomach drop. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was something else, something colder. Zara's hand instinctively went to her pulse rifle, but before she could react, Ryan's voice cut through the silence. "Zara," he said softly, his voice almost unrecognizable. "I'm sorry." Before she could process what he meant, everything happened at once. The world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. The sharp click of a weapon's safety being released echoed in the quiet, followed by a sudden rush of pain that exploded in Zara's side. Her vision blurred as she stumbled back, her hand instinctively reaching for the wound. The blood was warm and sticky against her fingers. She looked up in shock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ryan stood there, his expression unreadable, the weapon aimed directly at her. "No," she whispered, disbelief written all over her face. You were helping me. Why?" Ryan's expression remained cold, his lips barely moving as he spoke. "I didn't have a choice." The words didn't make sense. Zara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the betrayal. Ryan had been her ally, the one person she could trust in this nightmare of a war. But now, he was the one who had turned on her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't a human soldier trying to survive. He was something else, something far more dangerous. A traitor, a double agent. "I don't understand," Zara said through clenched teeth, her hand still clutching the wound in an effort to stop the bleeding. "I thought you were with me." Ryan's gaze flickered for a moment, a brief flicker of guilt passing through his eyes, before he hardened once again. "I'm not with you. I'm with the Nari. I always have been." Zara's breath caught in her throat. "What? You've been working for them this whole time?" Ryan shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. But I've been instructed to eliminate anyone who stands in their way. You were a threat, and I couldn't let you continue this fight." Zora's vision blurred as her head spun, her pulse racing. Betrayal wasn't something she could easily process. Her whole life had been about survival and protecting those she cared about. But now, everything she had believed in had shattered. She had trusted Ryan, believed in him, and he had betrayed her for the sake of the enemy. "You lied to me," Zora managed to say, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Ryan's eyes softened for a moment, but then he hardened again. "I didn't have a choice, Zora. I did what I had to do to survive. And now you have to die." Zora took a step back, trying to steady herself, but the pain in her side was overwhelming. She could feel the blood seeping through her fingers, and she knew she didn't have much time left. She had to act fast. She couldn't let Ryan's betrayal be the end of her. With one swift motion, Zora threw herself to the ground, rolling behind a pile of debris to take cover. The shot Ryan fired missed by inches, grazing the wall instead. Zora's heart raced, adrenaline flooding her system as she scrambled for her weapon. She couldn't let him get away with this. She had to survive. She had to make it out of here. And she would make sure that Ryan paid for his betrayal. "Zora, please," Ryan's voice called after her, his tone softening. "It doesn't have to be like this. We can end this now. Just surrender." Zora gritted her teeth, her hand gripping her weapon tightly as she rose from her hiding spot. "You should have never betrayed me," she whispered, her voice cold and full of fury. The battle for survival was no longer just about the war. It was personal now. Ryan would regret this. Zora's body was aching, but her spirit was still unbroken. The betrayal stung deep, a wound worse than the one on her side. Ryan's cold words echoed in her mind, but she pushed them aside. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for everyone she had lost. For all the innocent lives that had been destroyed by the Nari and their merciless reign. The pain from her wound was overwhelming, but she couldn't afford to collapse. She needed to keep moving. The final confrontation was drawing near, and every moment counted. Her mind raced as she adjusted her grip on her weapon, her hands shaking slightly from the blood loss. She couldn't let Ryan's treachery be the last thing she remembered. She couldn't let him win. Ryan's voice still echoed in her ears, his betrayal a bitter taste she couldn't spit out. But it was too late for regrets. It was time to act. Zora had trained for this. She had faced impossible odds before. And now it was time to face the worst of them. She glanced around the ruined building, searching for the right angle, the right spot. She needed a vantage point. The Nari forces would be here soon, their footsteps growing louder with every passing second. She had only one chance to make this count. Zora couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. She wouldn't let Ryan be the one to end her story. She moved swiftly, her footsteps light but deliberate as she crouched behind a broken wall. Her mind was sharp, her focus absolute. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, sharpening her senses. The world seemed to slow down as she listened for the faintest sound, the slightest movement. She could hear the enemy closing in, their voices muffled by the walls of the building. But she was ready. Zora held her breath, her weapon raised. She didn't know if she could take them all down. The Nari were powerful, technologically superior, but she had something they didn't: human willpower, the determination to fight until the last breath. She would not go down without a fight. The first Nari soldier appeared, his silhouette outlined against the dim light of the hallway. He moved cautiously, his weapon raised, scanning the area for any signs of danger. Zara's heart raced as she steadied her aim. This was it. She couldn't miss. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled the trigger. The blast rang out, echoing in the silence, and the Neri soldier collapsed to the ground with a muffled thud. Zara didn't hesitate. She moved to the next position, her footsteps quick but careful. Another soldier appeared, and Zara fired again. This time, the shot was clean, precise. Another enemy fell. But there were more coming. She couldn't let up now. Zara's pulse was pounding in her ears, her hands steady despite the pain in her side. She could hear the Neri soldiers calling out to each other, coordinating their movements. They were getting closer. The next wave was coming, and she had to be ready. She had no choice but to fight. This was her final stand, her last chance to make a difference. She couldn't afford to fail now. Her thoughts flashed to the soldiers who had fought beside her, to the people who had trusted her. She couldn't let them down. She couldn't let Ryan's betrayal be the end. As the Nari forces closed in, Zara prepared herself for the worst. She had no illusions that she would survive this fight. But she would make sure that the Nari paid for every life they had taken. She would make sure they knew that humanity wouldn't just roll over and die. Not without a fight. The next soldier appeared, but this time, Zara didn't wait for him to get close. She fired first, taking him down before he could even raise his weapon. But she wasn't fast enough to avoid the return fire. A blast hit her in the shoulder, sending her stumbling back. The pain was blinding, but she gritted her teeth and fought through it. She couldn't stop now. There were still more of them. Her vision blurred, but Zara didn't let that slow her down. She ducked behind another piece of debris, clutching her shoulder, her breaths ragged. The Nari were closing in, and she was running out of time. The sound of boots marching echoed louder, closer. It was now or never. Zara could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was still alive. And as long as she was alive, she would keep fighting. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then peeked around the corner. The enemy was almost upon her, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped out, firing once more. She hit her target, but the return fire was swift and deadly. Another blast grazed her leg, and she cried out in pain, but she didn't falter. She continued to fire, her body moving on instinct. She could feel herself weakening, but the fire in her heart burned brighter than ever. She would not be the one to fall. Not here. Not like this. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice, one she hadn't expected to hear again. Zara. Ryan. Zara's heart skipped a beat as she turned, her weapon still raised. She saw him standing there, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she wondered if this was some kind of trick. Was he here to finish what he started? But then something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of regret, a brief moment of doubt. Ryan's weapon lowered, and he took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I didn't know what I was doing. Before he could finish, the ground beneath them shook, and a deafening roar echoed in the distance. The Nari were coming. The final assault was beginning. Ryan and Zara exchanged one last glance, both knowing this might be the last time they'd ever speak. Zara's grip on her weapon tightened. The final stand was here. There was no going back. The battle was far from over, and she would fight until her last breath. The smoke hung thick in the air, the scent of burning wreckage mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Zara's body was battered, bruised, and barely holding together, but her spirit was still unbroken. The Nari forces were retreating, and though she could barely stand, she felt a strange sense of accomplishment wash over her. The final battle had been fierce, but humanity had won. Against all odds, against the betrayal, against everything the Nari threw at them, they had triumphed. But victory had come at a high cost. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, human and alien alike. Zara's eyes scanned the devastation around her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the loss. Bonner was gone. His death was something she would never forget. He had been a brother in arms, a friend, and his sacrifice had been one of the many that led them to this moment. She had made it through the final stand. But the world around her had changed forever. The Nari, once so sure of their supremacy, had been driven back. They were no longer the invincible force they had once seemed to be. Zara had witnessed firsthand the power of human resilience. In the face of overwhelming odds, humanity had fought back. It wasn't just the weapons that had won the battle. It was the will to survive, the refusal to be enslaved, the determination to hold on to what was right, no matter the cost. Zara took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes still scanning the horizon. It was over. The enemy was retreating, but there was still much work to be done. The survivors would need to rebuild, to heal. The Nari had taken so much from them, but they hadn't broken them. Humanity had shown that they were not to be underestimated. Her mind wandered back to Ryan. His sudden appearance at the final moment had been unexpected. He had turned the tide, but the question still lingered in Zora's mind. Could she ever trust him again? His betrayal had been a painful reminder of how fragile trust could be, but there was something in his eyes that made her wonder. Maybe he had finally seen the error of his ways. Maybe there was more to him than the man who had once turned his back on them all. Zara didn't know, and for now she wasn't sure she wanted to. There were bigger things to focus on. The war was over, but the journey ahead was just beginning. Her thoughts were interrupted as a figure approached. Ryan. His face was grim, but there was something different about him. A recognition, perhaps. A recognition of the cost of his actions. His footsteps were slow, hesitant, as if unsure of how to approach her after everything that had happened. Zara stiffened, but she didn't turn away. She had made it through the worst of it. She could face this moment too. "I know you probably don't want to see me," Ryan started, his voice rough. "But I owe you an apology." Zara didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She was tired, her wounds still fresh, but there was something in Ryan's eyes that made her pause. Regret, genuine regret. And maybe that was enough. Maybe he had finally come to terms with the choices he had made. "I don't know if you can forgive me," he continued, "but I'm sorry for everything. I was wrong. I know that now." Zara took a slow breath, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her. She had lost so much, and it had all led to this moment. This was the man who had betrayed her, betrayed all of them. And now he was asking for forgiveness. She wasn't sure if she could give it, but she didn't want to hold on to the anger anymore. The battle was over. The enemy was beaten. Maybe it was time to move on. "You were wrong," Zara said softly, her voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. We've all lost something in this war, Ryan. Maybe it's time to stop looking back and start thinking about what comes next." Ryan nodded, a faint flicker of relief crossing his face. "Thank you," he whispered, almost to himself. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the bitter taste of defeat and triumph intertwined. As the Nari retreated into the distance, Zara knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead. Rebuilding would take time, and trust would need to be earned. But humanity had proven something extraordinary on this battlefield. They had proven that they were more than capable of standing up to the greatest threats in the galaxy, and as long as there was hope, they would continue to fight. The ruins of the battlefield were a grim reminder of the sacrifices made, but there was a quiet sense of hope now, too. Humanity was still standing. They had survived, and with each passing day, they would rebuild, stronger than before. Zara's gaze shifted toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the devastated land. A new day, a new dawn. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without scars, but it was a fresh start. There were still so many questions that remained unanswered. What would happen to the Nari? How would the galaxy change now that humanity had proven it wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game? But those were questions for another time. For now, Zora allowed herself to take a moment of peace, a moment to breathe, to let the weight of the last few days fall away. "I'm not sure what the future holds," Ryan said quietly, standing beside her. "But I know one thing. We'll face it together." Zora didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded, her hand gripping her weapon tightly. She didn't know what the future held either. But one thing was certain: humanity had won. They had survived, and they were ready for whatever came next. Together, the sun rose higher in the sky, and with it, the promise of a new beginning.